And as he said about the scripts, like it's great because oftentimes like the storyboard artist is really what kind of breathes life into the films. The script artist may have an idea of what it may look like, but the storyboard artist is what is the role that kind of communicates that to make it look like what it's eventually going to look like on the big screen. So one thing that is very common, especially in early storyboard artists, is the flat staging, which is basically where I make a storyboard. Often, by the way, storyboards will be done in marker because they're very bold. You really want to communicate a lot with very few lines. But I wouldn't do that for your portfolio. Like for early, when you're just getting started, pencil's probably the best you can get for storyboards. So flat staging is basically where if I drew a character, just making sure everyone can see this. So it's something like this, basically, where maybe I'll have a character here and then a character here. Very simple drawings. I'm not trying to impress you guys. And it's basically where you don't include any background. And this is kind of where everyone starts. They'll start storyboarding a whole sequence just with characters that are seemingly sort of floating in space. And that's one of those little habits that you really want to kick. Even if it's just including a little bit of what's in the background, even if there isn't really much in the background, maybe they're actually looking, there's just sky. Even if you just include like a little cloud, just to help the scene a little bit, or like a sun, or maybe a little bit of grass in the background, maybe just something that'll make it a little bit more diverse, which leads to the next point. One thing that my teachers were always a really big fan of, especially if there's a lot of things going on in the scene, is including a bit of a grid. So by that I mean, if you have, say, a shot of a character in an open field or something, you could kind of include like some aspects of the background, such as maybe there's like a clump of grass in the foreground, or a rock, or maybe there's a distant castle kind of off in the distance. But if you actually include a bit of a grid, kind of like think of like a perspective grid. So when you're building a perspective, any kind of perspective scene, you have your two vanishing points and horizon line. You can start to kind of create a bit of a grid. And this is actually a very common technique when drawing in animation at all, because one thing that you'll notice when you get into animation school is that you don't use rulers anymore, even when you're drawing perspective things. So it's good to kind of get in the habit of being able to make your own perspective grid, because once you have this, it gives you the kind of skeleton to be able to draw any objects within this field. It looks a little confusing right now, but so these are all the kind of possible lines that I can use to build any shapes. So for example, if I'm going to draw a building, I know that there's going to be the vertical line, and then I can just kind of follow the previous lines that I made to create an actual structure of some kind. So now I know that this line is going to eventually, it's going to have to follow that same vanishing line that I drew. So it's going to look something like this, maybe. So the grid just allows you to have a little bit more realism in your scene. So even if you're drawing like a scene that's not just straight on, like a cityscape or something, it's still nice if you actually include a bit of a grid. Say there's like these rolling hills, for example. Just even like a little bit of showing what the terrain might look like. One teacher I had was obsessed with these grids, and he'd want us always to include some kind of grid, even if it's not perfectly accurate in perspective, just something so that we know, so that we can estimate kind of if the ground's like soft, or if it's round, or maybe it's really steep. Maybe there's actually like a cliff at this point. And so just including like a bit of a grid really helps people understand like the forms and how far back maybe. Like if you have the grid really tapering back into the distance, for example, and it gets like smaller, smaller, smaller as it goes back, then we know that it's going to take place in a wide scene. So this is a nice way to actually like communicate that without having to render out the entire background scene, because that all takes so long. So and this is great for, especially for establishing shots, which are usually the first shots in a film, and they help to kind of establish the overall scene. It's always that shot where you see like the landscape or the house that it takes place in, or the big castle, the big kind of wide shot at the beginning. When using dialogue, and I'm not sure if you guys will have to worry about this too much early on, because often it's just very, it's almost like a pantomime. You hardly have any voice, especially I believe in the portfolio that you guys would be making. But if you are including your own storyboard, for example, that will include some kind of dialogue, one thing, this is this line. Yeah, so when you kind of set up the scene, for example, so say there's character A and character B. If this is how this scene is set up, just make sure that whenever you're composing the shots, you split this sort of in half. So this is the B side of the screen. This is the A side. And even if you change the shot, make sure that this B character is always on this side of the screen. This is something that I never even realized. But if you look for this in movies from now on, just to see when they set up a dialogue between two characters, whatever side the A character starts on, they will stay on. It's like it's this weird little thing, and it just helps you to understand. It's one of those things that just make it more clear. But we never even see it. Again, like the guy said, storyboarding is sort of like the invisible workings behind the scenes that make things really like clear, so you don't ever have to worry about being confused about who's who. So they used to experiment with this when they didn't really have a hang of storyboarding mechanics early on, and they would have, if they would switch the screen. So for example, if say the next shot after this one, if character B suddenly was on this side, even if it's like a close-up, maybe it's a close-up of his head. If this suddenly was character B right after this shot, then it feels really strange because you're expecting A character to be on this side of the screen. So just make sure that B character is always on this side. Even if you're kind of switching back and forth between, we'll talk about over-the-shoulder shots a little bit later, but so the next shot after this might look like, once this is like sort of, you've established the scene of these two characters talking, you might then have an over-the-shoulder shot of character A, but again, making sure that they're on this side. And then character B, this is very common where they'll have like kind of a back and forth between the over-the-shoulder shots of both characters. And character B will be smaller, but it's still on the same side. So something like that. And then the next shot, of course, you'll have a little bit of dialogue there. And then the next shot will likely be something like this, where it's sort of switched. So then the B character will be more in the foreground, and the A character will be further in the background. It gets a little bit more complicated, obviously, if you add more characters into the scene, but if you can kind of keep to this general rule, it'll really help your clarity when you're communicating. And this is what he was talking about. He was talking about having very smart shots, like smart shooting. If you're shooting smart, you're making sure that you're never like switching it, because that'll just confuse people. So that's like one really important thing when doing dialogue. So these are some of the shot types that you'll be seeing a lot of. We had to read some textbooks actually in animation school. One of them was called Shot by Shot. And it kind of goes through these really intricately. And I believe it was some of the early filmmakers like Hitchcock that started to coin some of these terms, because he was really, really big on storyboarding. He really saw the importance of it. So extreme close-up, we're going to go through each of these one by one. But there's extreme close-ups, medium shots, long shots, establishing shot, over-the-shoulder shot, and so many more. But these are sort of like the core. And even just with these, you can tell most of the story. So if you kind of get used to trying on each of these shots, then it'll really help. Extreme close-up, I have a bunch of images from The Incredibles because it's great, and there's great examples of all the different kinds of shots in the movie. It's always the shot that's right on. It's often to show a change of emotion, some kind of like extreme like aspect of someone's face, or maybe when they realize something suddenly in the story, you'll see it like an extreme close-up of their face. Like in this one, for example. So it helps to add a lot of drama to the scene. If you want to add a lot of drama, then this is one of those shots that will do that. Also, if you have a character that's very is maybe your villain or very honest looking in some way, maybe he's got a secret plan. What is very common, and what they're sort of doing here but not quite, is having a sort of up shot. and we'll talk about these a little bit later, but an upshot that's often underlit, if it's lit from beneath, then that'll make them look very like sort of villainous and scary. So that's a very common thing if you're trying to like make a character a little bit evil. The close-up is sort of the, well, not standard, but it's a very common shot that you'll see, especially when you're introducing the characters. A close-up is often, you get to see their face and what they're all about. It's a little bit less dramatic, obviously, than the extreme close-up, but equally important. I think this is one of the introduction shots of the Mr. Incredible. And again, with the close-up, that's when you want to start adding a little bit of background in, even if it's just like a little bit of details. You don't need to know, like your job isn't to know what the background's going to be like, but you want to at least suggest where they might actually be. So you might have like a, and also the one thing that I would criticize this shot of actually is that it's fairly centered. It's a little bit off center, but that whole thing that everyone learns in art school, the rule of thirds, that's actually very, very important in storyboarding. You'll see it used all the time. I'm subconsciously doing it without necessarily realizing it, but it's one of those things that sort of just is ingrained in you. So what is often very common is to have a close-up shot. Just be aware of those kind of, the thirds of the screen. So if I have a character here, for example, starting to get a little bit of detail. So just include like a little bit of background, even if it's just like the door of the room or something. Just something beyond just, a straight background. If you can add like a little bit of texture, that's even better. So add a little of the doorknob. Maybe it's like a bit of a sort of rustic house, so you might add like a little bit of a mark on the wall. Just anything you can do to liven up the place a little bit, because you don't want to leave it just straight. Everything is kind of just working right. It's nice if you can change it a little bit. And one thing that I actually did, which I wouldn't recommend, is evening things off. And that's where you basically keep the frame of the shot. Nothing should ever be exactly parallel to the frame. So for example, this door, it might help, for example, if I make the perspective a little bit off, just like up on an angle maybe, which just means that sort of the horizon line will be over here, and it's just a little bit angled a little bit differently, because you'll rarely see everything line up perfectly. Like it never is right on. So it's nice to add a little bit of variation there. And it also makes more for an interesting shot. We could also add a light. One thing that I used to do a lot, which is kind of a bad habit to get into, is putting things right behind the character. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I find a lot of artists are really drawn to kind of putting poles or other like vertical things like right behind the character's head. And just be aware that that's going to look a little weird, because it's going to look like something's like prodding your character. Or like if, for example, if I made like this light, for example, if it was right on his head, I mean, you could use that intentionally, I guess, to signal that he has an idea or something subtle or silly like that. But it's just a weird composition. So when you're the artist, you have the ability to change anything at will. So you can move this around however you want. And even in 3D, like 3D is a little bit trickier because once you make the scene, obviously it's kind of stuck. Like you can't exactly move things around. You can't manipulate it as much as you can in 2D animation. But you can still, every now and then, they'll still take a light if it's positioned exactly behind a character, if it's awkward or there's a chair in the way or something. They'll often just move it for the sake of shot composition. So shot composition is kind of the most important thing above everything of these, even above logic in most cases. So yeah, just like adding a little bit of detail. I'm just saying this because for your portfolio, like the more little subtle details you can include, the better it's going to be, especially because they give you the characters. I don't know what characters it is this year. They change it every year. But if you could just add a little bit, maybe look at that character and imagine what kind of personality they might have and where they might live, for example, or what environment they might be in, and try to get as much out of that story as you can when you're designing the backgrounds. So that's a close-up. Medium shot. So medium shot is pretty much the standard shot. It's the most common that you'll see in movies. And it's often, the close-up, as you can see, it's usually from the shoulders up or even just the face. The extreme close-up is basically just the face with very, very little else. You'll rarely see a background in the extreme close-up. But the medium shot, that's where you really start to see the environment. That's often the shot that you'll use when you're introducing a new scene, for example. You'll have a medium shot to show a lot of your character, but also a significant amount of the background. So as you can see here, this is a great example. It's often even from the waist up. So usually like about anything that's around that kind of level will be considered a medium shot. And this, you can obviously have multiple characters, and this is when you can start to actually add more elements into the scene, maybe add a bit of perspective, a building in the background that's sort of coming out. If it's like a street scene or something. And this is when you really have to start being a little bit conscious of your composition, because you're probably going to have a lot of background elements in these scenes. This is a very simple shot, but usually you'll have quite a lot of things going on. So just be aware of that when you're designing your medium shots. Also, if you're setting up a gag, if you're setting up some kind of joke, medium shots are often used to do that too. So long shots are some directors use a lot of long shots and some hardly use any. So it's hard to say, but they're generally used to set up a scene. Like the medium shot I mentioned can do that, but the long shot, especially if it's sort of an environmental scene, like there's lots of landscape as there is in this one, you kind of set up the whole location and atmosphere and maybe what it feels like. So long shots are great. Wes Anderson, the director that the guy was talking about, he's a live action director. But he's a big fan of these really, really super long shots that just kind of stretch on for ages. He basically draws entire setups, like entire buildings and things, and then just has tiny little people just to set up the scene. Because it's nice to kind of see the environment before you go into it. So often right after a long shot, there'll be, you start to move in through the environment. So maybe some medium shots, maybe some close-ups even. And the closer of a transition there is from, so say, a long shot transitioning to a close-up or an extreme close-up, that will create quite an emotional reaction from your audience, because you're switching from very far away to sort of right in someone's face. So you can actually use those kind of switches to your advantage, because it adds a lot of drama, especially if you're setting up like a villain or something. This is what I mentioned earlier. It's very common in dialogue. So an over-the-shoulder shot is where it's exactly what it sounds like. You have one of the characters and it's shooting over the shoulder. So yeah, it's great for conversational pieces. I don't know if you'll need to use in your portfolio so much because they're interacting with objects. You could always have an over-the-shoulder shot, for example, of I'm not sure what the characters are now, but I drew Alex the alley cat. That was my character when I did it. So what you might do, I believe they have to interact with a box, or they have to interact with something. So it's a great way to introduce that object, whatever that may be. So you might have Alex's face, for example, kind of looking off, maybe into the distance a little bit. And then have it looking down. You kind of have his point of view. So have it look down at this sort of ominous looking box all by itself. That's sort of a great way to show it. And it also gives you the opportunity to show some of the background that you can include and things like that. So that would be a nice shot, for example, if you want to include in your storyboard. And it also shows, this is often one that beginners don't think of as much. It's just one of those ones that you see all the time, and they're kind of taken for granted. So if you can integrate some of the shoulder shots in, that'd be fantastic. I really like using them because it kind of gives you a point, the character's point of view, without actually taking it right to their vision, their point of view. And of course, the next one is the actual point of view shot, and that's where you're literally in the eyes of the character. And it can also be used to show, like, you've seen this shot in films a lot, where you have a character that's being followed by someone. And if you don't want to reveal who that person is, you just have that person's point of view as they're sort of like following or creeping up on someone. So that can be really effective. I don't know, this is one of those ones that you have to use sparingly, otherwise it'll feel like you have you're just looking only from their point of view. So use it carefully, use it well, and it can be really effective. But it's not super common. One thing that they also used to do to experiment in some French films, I believe in the 50s or 60s, is in the point of view shots, they'd have, obviously if that character is speaking to another character, then there'll be a character looking directly at you, the camera, and it makes you feel really weird. So that's one thing to avoid, is never have any character looking directly at the camera. If anything, they should be looking slightly off. So just really be aware of that, the eye line of the characters. So even if they're kind of looking just slightly off, it'll help a lot, because when they start to look directly at you, it's called the fourth wall. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but when you break the full fourth wall, that's when you make the viewer feel like they're being watched, as opposed to they're kind of lost in the experience of watching a movie. So just be aware of breaking that fourth wall. You can do it very close, like I drew here, but just not looking directly at you. These are kind of just what you can have close-ups within these, but these are 1-shot, 2-shot, 3-shot, group shot, and it's really interesting, the dynamics that kind of occur once you have to lay these shots out. I love this 3-shot, for example. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on it. Exactly get over there, but you can kind of see that there's the two cops. One's in the foreground, one's sort of in the background, and that he's right between them. So that already communicates that there's some sort of altercation here. Maybe it adds a lot of drama, which is really nice. And then in this 2-shot, this is a typical kind of walking with the camera, which is nice to show, especially if there's some kind of debriefing going on or something, or some kind of communication that needs to be passed to the character. And the group shot, these can be tricky. The more characters you start adding into a scene, the more complicated it's going to be, especially if there's multiple dialogue lines for each of them. Because then how do you make those cuts and still make it clear that who's speaking and what's going on, where are they really going? So that's something that the storyboard artists really need to be aware of, and it can be quite tricky. Like we kind of take these things for granted because we're not the ones creating the storyboards for these films. When you watch a film, things usually just make sense. If it's done well, you can kind of follow it very easily. But that's actually, it takes a lot of work to get it to work as they do. Just one more here. This is one that I really like. Rack focus. You've probably seen this before, where this is kind of a new technique, especially because cameras for a while couldn't even do this. So it's really nice. But it's often, I find this is overused sometimes. Often there'll be a lot of these rack focuses, which is basically where you switch from blurring the foreground to blurring the background. But when used well, like in this case, it's used really well because this is actually introducing the next scene to follow. It's really a great way to transition. It's basically a way to transition without even having to cut. Usually what they would do is they have a shot on Mr. Incredible, and then they cut to the scene down here and isolate that. But this is a really nice way to kind of, you're sort of following the character look, as opposed to having to cut and start a new scene that way. That's sort of a very traditional way of doing it. So yeah, I really like using the rack focus, but again, it's hard to indicate in the storyboard, especially because without being able to blur. I mean, if you're doing a digital storyboard, which is a good idea, I really like doing storyboards digitally, then you can actually blur your drawing in Photoshop, for example. So that's a really great technique to do that. So these are generally the shots that you'll use. There's unlimited amounts of shots, but these are sort of the most common, and they're just all done in different ways. So how you sort of align those is really up to you. But generally, just think of first, you want to establish the scene. And usually, not always in this order, but usually you introduce the characters. and then you introduce some sort of action that's going to occur. It's obvious, it's very kind of taken for granted, but, and I'll write this. And then you just kind of repeat this as new actions occur, or new characters introduced, or drama introduces into the story. So maybe we could start doing some storyboards. How do you guys feel about that? Do you have any ideas, or do you have the characters, for example, that are for the storyboard for this the portfolios that are due this year?
Yeah. I haven't gotten any emails like that or anything yet.
Okay, no problem. I wonder if they're, I don't know if I can get them actually.